In the mid-1990s, Arthur W. Frank published a landmark and fascinating study on people's response to illness, entitled The Wounded Storyteller. As a professor of sociology at the University of Calgary, Frank considered the various ways we respond to our illness, particularly the illnesses that are chronic in their character. He identified a number of responses that we make to our experiences of such illness, ranging from denial through to resignation, none of which he found were especially helpful in learning how to live in the fullest way in the face of our illness. And so what he suggested as the most redemptive or transformative pathway was what he termed as being the wounded storyteller, arriving at a position in acceptance of our illness that could allow it to become something shared with others. As we learn to tell the narrative of our illness in a way that includes others, joins with others, allows possibility for others, then we discover, or at least can discover, the seeds of a new sense of courage and meaning in what we are going through. We do not choose our suffering. In many ways, for reasons unknown to us, our suffering chooses us. But we can choose what attitude we bring to our suffering, and this can make all the difference. None of us ever imagined that we would be in our current situation of anxiety, with all of our social restrictions, with the inability for us to come together, the prospect of our churches closed for some months still to come. We are in a climate of suffering that is both social and economic, and for some, of course, physical, especially those who are struck by the coronavirus. Suffering chooses us. And in its selection of us, we can either be passive or we can be active. We can allow the situation to overwhelm us and render us as victims, or we can engage the situation and determine that to which it is calling us. We may be reminded of that helpful passage in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings when Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times." But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time given to us. And so this reorients our passivity into passion. There's an intrinsic link between the two words. They both come from the root word in Latin meaning suffering. In each, there is suffering, but they are very different in their outcome. A passive life is one paralyzed. A passionate life is one lived with possibility. I was struck during the week coming across a remarkable diary entry of Edith Stein, the Jewish philosopher who became a Carmelite nun, transported to Auschwitz. She made an observation that I think is very apt in our own circumstances. In the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands in August 1942, she wrote, "We are very calm and cheerful. Of course, so far there has been no Mass and communion. Maybe that will come later. Now, we have a chance to experience a little how to live purely from within." And so even in her deprivation, Edith identified possibility. Do we live with passivity or do we live with passion? On this Passion Sunday, we reflect on the suffering of Jesus. Day by day this week, we will be led into the drama of his suffering, all of which is the consequence of his passionate love. The suffering Christ stands almost as the epitome of human suffering. He mirrors suffering humanity. And yet, at the height of his suffering on the cross, he is surrounded by two very different attitudes to suffering. exemplified by the two figures crucified with him. And in some ways, I think they represent the two very different responses that we make to our own experience of suffering, however it may present itself to us. The first figure cannot reconcile suffering with his understanding of God. If God exists, he thinks, how can there be suffering? Suffering for him is a negation of God. If God were truly good, there would be no suffering in the world. Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us, he says. In other words, deliver us, free us, defend us from our suffering. It's the attitude that we hear on so many different occasions. It's the attitude that profoundly struggles with the reality of suffering, and which regards suffering as the antithesis of the life to which we aspire, controlled, clean, contained. The premise in that thinking is that suffering and a life fully lived cannot go together. But the second figure, interestingly the one whom legend suggests as the revolutionary, the one who fought for a different life, a better future, represents quite a different attitude. Rather than defending himself against suffering, he seems to enter it. He accepts the reality of his suffering. He's not afraid of it. He rather reflects on it. But more than this, he sees in his suffering the possibility of companionship with the other who suffers alongside him. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And for him, this openness in the midst of his vulnerability transforms him. Truly, I tell you, says Jesus, today you will be with me in paradise. The extraordinary drama of the crucifixion of Jesus, to which we are being led throughout this week, is the most remarkable journey into the paradox of suffering. None of us want to suffer. All of us are committed to alleviating suffering. But suffering is an unavoidable experience in life. It's a constituent element of our identity as creatures, limited, finite, mortal, all of which is being brought home so starkly in our experience of this pandemic. At the heart of life is the struggle to answer the question about suffering. Through our own encounter with the crucified and risen Christ, as Christians, we have answered the question in a very precise way. Suffering love is the one answer to anxiety suffered. In other words, a love that holds another, bears another, carries another, journeys with another, yes, even in the context of our current physical distancing from one another. This is what ultimately transforms the experience of suffering from one of passivity into one of passion. In other words, in the suffering we experience, there is a possibility, the possibility of recognizing at an even deeper level than before our need of one another. This current suffering teaches us that isolation is not our future, that we cannot live fully apart from each other. And so this moment in history can teach us in a unique way how we ourselves can become wounded storytellers, people who allow our wound or our moment of suffering to become a new source of meaning. This is the possibility experienced by the second figure suffering with Jesus on Calvary. May it be ours also, for then our own Calvary will become our Easter.